Racist cop forces black woman to the stand unaware she oversees judicial ethics that target his misconduct. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to the main character. The courtroom in downtown Columbus, Ohio, carried a familiar stillness, the kind that settled into the wooden benches and lingered in the air long before the judge ever entered the room. On this particular morning, that stillness felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Officer Daniel Whitmore stood near the prosecution table with the confidence of someone who believed the room belonged to him. His uniform was pressed, his posture rigid, and his expression carried the ease of a man accustomed to being believed without question. Across the room, Evelyn Carter sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze steady but unassuming. She wore a simple navy blazer, nothing that drew attention, nothing that signaled authority to anyone watching closely for signs of it. To most people in the gallery, she looked like just another name on the docket, another black woman called into a system that rarely slowed down to see her clearly. When Officer Whitmore spoke, his voice cut cleanly through the room, sharp but controlled, each word chosen to assert command without raising its volume. He addressed the judge, then turned his attention toward Evelyn, gesturing for her to stand and approach the witness stand. The motion was practiced, almost casual, as if he were directing traffic instead of compelling a person to rise under the weight of public scrutiny. Evelyn stood without hesitation. Her chair made a soft sound against the floor, small but noticeable in the quiet room. She walked forward at an even pace, her steps measured, her expression composed. There was no defiance in her face, but there was no fear either. The gallery shifted subtly, people adjusting their posture, eyes following her path, curiosity mixing with assumption. Officer Whitmore continued, framing his questions with an edge that suggested impatience, as though her presence itself were an inconvenience. He spoke as if the outcome were already decided, as if the process were a formality meant to confirm what he believed everyone already knew. Evelyn listened. She did not interrupt. She did not rush her answers. Each response was calm, precise, and respectful, delivered with a steadiness that contrasted sharply with the tone being directed at her. The judge watched quietly, hands folded, allowing the exchange to continue. Somewhere behind the bench, a clerk paused, pen hovering just above the page, eyes flicking up and back down again. There were details in the room that most people missed, the way a court officer shifted uncomfortably, the way a sealed folder rested untouched near the edge of the desk, the way the air itself seemed to tighten with every confident word Officer Whitmore spoke. Evelyn's gaze briefly moved across the room, not searching for help, not asking for permission, but observing, as though she were taking note of the very system unfolding around her. To anyone watching without context, this was a familiar scene, authority pressing down, compliance expected, order maintained. Yet beneath that surface, something else was already in motion, something patient and deliberate, waiting for the right moment to surface. For now, Evelyn Carter stood at the witness stand, appearing exactly as Officer Whitmore assumed she was, unaware in his mind, insignificant in his estimation, and entirely under his control, while the truth, quiet and unannounced, rested just beneath the polished wood and formal language of the courtroom, ready to reshape everything that followed. The judge finally adjusted his glasses and asked the clerk to swear in the witness, and the routine words echoed softly through the courtroom as Evelyn Carter placed her hand on the stand and gave her affirmation in a calm, even voice. The sound carried without strain, steady enough to draw a few subtle glances from the gallery. Officer Daniel Whitmore watched her closely now, his confidence unchanged but sharpened, as if he sensed the room responding to something he could not quite define. He stepped closer to the lectern, papers neatly aligned, and began again, framing his questions with polished formality that barely concealed his impatience. He asked about dates, about procedures, about actions that seemed ordinary on the surface, but carried a tone of accusation underneath, as though each answer were expected to reveal a mistake. Evelyn responded without hesitation, not rushing, not filling the silence with unnecessary words. Each sentence was complete, deliberate, and precise, spoken with the clarity of someone accustomed to weighing meaning carefully. The rhythm of the exchange slowed the room. Even the air conditioning hum seemed quieter as people leaned in, listening not for drama, but for something else they could not yet name. Officer Whitmore pressed on, repeating questions in slightly different ways, attempting to guide the answers toward conclusions that suited his narrative. Each time, Evelyn corrected nothing overtly, but allowed the facts to stand exactly as they were, neither softened nor sharpened. Her eyes remained forward, focused on the judge, never lingering on the officer longer than necessary. It was a composure that unsettled rather than challenged. A few rows back, a woman in a gray suit stopped taking notes and folded her hands. Near the aisle, a court officer shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing briefly toward the bench and then back to the witness stand. Officer Whitmore cleared his throat and adjusted his stance, his voice tightening just slightly as he referenced internal processes, disciplinary protocols, and oversight mechanisms with a tone that suggested distance from consequence. He spoke as if those structures existed somewhere far removed from him, theoretical rather than personal. Evelyn listened, her expression unchanged, but something subtle moved behind her eyes, a recognition rather than a reaction. When she answered, she did not dispute his words. She expanded them, calmly describing how such processes were designed to function, how accountability was meant to move through layers of review, how integrity depended not on rank, but on adherence to ethical standards. Her words were measured, educational even, and the judge nodded once, slowly, as if appreciating the clarity. Officer Whitmore paused, then smiled faintly, a gesture meant to reassert control, and thanked her before pivoting toward what he seemed to believe would be his final point. He spoke about authority, about order, about the importance of officers making decisions without fear of interference. The word interference hung in the air longer than he intended. Evelyn inhaled quietly and answered with a tone that remained respectful, but carried a deeper weight. She spoke about trust, about how public confidence rested on transparency, and how systems only remained strong when misconduct was addressed, not ignored. There was no accusation. In her voice, only certainty. The courtroom felt different now, as if the familiar script had slipped slightly off its tracks. The sealed folder on the bench remained unopened, but more eyes drifted toward it, drawn by an unspoken awareness that it was no longer just an object, but a promise of context yet to come. The judge leaned back slightly, folding his hands as Officer Daniel Whitmore concluded his line of questioning with a tone that suggested finality, as though the essential points had already been proven. A quiet murmur moved through the gallery, not loud enough to interrupt, but present enough to signal that attention had sharpened. Evelyn Carter remained standing at the witness stand, her posture unchanged, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the polished wood. She waited, not because she was uncertain, but because she understood the rhythm of the room and the weight of timing. The judge glanced down at his notes, then up at Evelyn, and asked if she wished to clarify any part of her testimony. The question was procedural, neutral, yet shifted the atmosphere. Evelyn nodded once and spoke, her voice steady, carrying easily through the courtroom. She clarified points Officer Whitmore had referenced, not to challenge him directly, but to place them within a broader framework of responsibility. She spoke about oversight not as an abstract concept, but as a living process designed to protect the integrity of the courts themselves. As she spoke, a subtle tension surfaced in Officer Whitmore's stance. He adjusted his jacket, his jaw tightening briefly before he smoothed his expression and resumed his composed demeanor. He listened, arms loosely crossed, projecting patience while his eyes tracked every word. Evelyn continued, describing how ethical review operated across jurisdictions, how complaints were evaluated, and how patterns were identified over time rather than through isolated incidents. Her language was careful, almost instructional, as if she were explaining the structure to someone unfamiliar with it. The judge nodded again, slower this time, and glanced toward the sealed folder near his right hand. He did not open it, but his fingers rested there, signaling awareness. The prosecutor shifted in his chair, exchanging a brief look with the clerk, who quietly adjusted the stack of documents beside her. Officer Whitmore cleared his throat and interjected with a question meant to reassert direction, asking whether Evelyn's understanding was based on personal opinion or formal training. The phrasing was polite, but its implication was clear. Evelyn met the question without pause. She stated that her understanding came from years of professional experience working within judicial ethics systems, from reviewing cases, issuing recommendations, and ensuring compliance across multiple courts. Her tone remained calm, but something in the room changed. A few heads turned more fully now, curiosity giving way to recognition that her role was not as peripheral as initially assumed. Officer Whitmore smiled faintly again, a gesture that appeared practiced, and responded that many professionals held advisory roles without direct authority. The words advisory and authority lingered as he spoke them. Evelyn acknowledged the distinction and added, carefully, that oversight did not require public visibility to be effective. She explained that its strength lay in independence, consistency, and documentation, not in appearances. The judge's pen stopped moving. The silence that followed was not awkward, but deliberate, as though the courtroom itself were allowing the meaning to settle. Officer Whitmore shifted his weight, then glanced briefly toward the judge, as if expecting a cue that did not arrive. Evelyn remained composed, her gaze forward, her presence steady. The gallery felt different now, no longer watching a routine exchange, but witnessing the gradual unfolding of context. Somewhere within that stillness, the assumptions that had framed the morning began to loosen, making space for a truth that had not yet been spoken aloud, but was steadily moving closer to the surface. The judge thanked Evelyn Carter for her clarification and allowed the record to stand, but Officer Daniel Whitmore did not step back as expected. Instead, he moved closer to the lectern again, his tone sharpening under a veneer of professionalism, as if determined to reclaim momentum. He questioned her familiarity with departmental procedures, emphasizing the autonomy of law enforcement and suggesting that external reviews often misunderstood the realities officers faced in the field. His words were deliberate, carefully framed to sound reasonable, yet they carried an undercurrent of dismissal. Evelyn listened without interruption, her expression composed, her posture unchanged. When she answered, she did not debate his experience or diminish his role. She acknowledged the complexity of law enforcement work and spoke about how ethical oversight existed precisely because such complexity demanded accountability. Her voice remained even, but the certainty in her phrasing drew the attention of everyone in the room. Officer Whitmore pressed further, referencing past complaints in a general sense, describing them as common, often unsubstantiated, and part of the unavoidable noise surrounding public service. The gallery shifted again, a few quiet exhales audible as people sensed the direction he was taking. Evelyn responded by explaining how patterns, not isolated reports, informed ethical review, how consistency across cases revealed truths that single incidents could not. She spoke with the calm assurance of someone who had studied such patterns extensively. The judge leaned forward slightly now, his gaze alternating between the witness stand and Officer Whitmore. The clerk's fingers paused above the keyboard, waiting. Officer Whitmore asked whether Evelyn had ever personally participated in disciplinary recommendations, framing the question as if expecting a limited answer. Evelyn replied that she had overseen numerous evaluations, coordinated with multiple jurisdictions, and ensured that findings aligned with judicial standards. Her words were precise, unembellished, and difficult to dismiss. A quiet tension settled into Officer Whitmore's shoulders. He straightened, adjusted his papers, and offered a brief nod, as if acknowledging her response while internally recalibrating. He attempted to redirect the focus, suggesting that oversight bodies sometimes overstepped, creating unnecessary scrutiny for officers who were simply doing their jobs. Evelyn did not argue the premise. She responded by stating that ethical review did not exist to punish, but to preserve trust, and that transparency protected institutions as much as it protected the public. The judge cleared his throat softly, signaling awareness that the exchange was moving beyond routine questioning. The sealed folder remained unopened, but its presence felt heavier now, almost expectant. Officer Whitmore hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing, his confidence no longer effortless. He spoke about respect for authority, about order in the courtroom, about the importance of recognizing roles. Evelyn met that with a statement about responsibility accompanying authority, about how respect was sustained through conduct rather than demanded through position. The room felt still, not silent with discomfort, but attentive with recognition. A few people in the gallery leaned forward, their expressions thoughtful rather than judgmental. Officer Whitmore finally stepped back, signaling the end of his questions, but the shift had already occurred. Evelyn remained at the stand, steady and unflinching, not triumphant, not defensive, simply present. The judge looked down at his notes once more, then toward the sealed folder, his hand resting there again. In that moment it became clear to those paying attention that this was no longer a simple matter of testimony. The structure of the room, the rhythm of authority, and the assumptions carried into the morning had begun to rearrange themselves, quietly and irrevocably, as the truth edged closer to being fully seen. The judge called for a brief pause to allow the record to reflect the testimony, and the courtroom settled into a tense stillness that felt heavier than before. Evelyn Carter remained at the witness stand, her hands resting calmly, her breathing steady, as if she were unaffected by the quiet weight pressing in from every direction. Officer Daniel Whitmore returned to his seat, though the ease he carried earlier had diminished, replaced by a controlled stiffness that did not go unnoticed. The judge reviewed his notes slowly, each page turned with deliberate care, while the clerk adjusted the microphone and glanced toward the bench, waiting. In the gallery, people sat straighter now, less passive than when the morning began, their attention sharpened by the sense that something important was unfolding beneath the surface. Evelyn's gaze moved briefly across the room, not lingering on any single face, but observing the subtle shifts in posture and expression, the way awareness had begun to replace assumption. The judge cleared his throat and addressed Evelyn again, asking a neutral follow-up about her professional background, framed as a matter of context rather than challenge. Evelyn answered with clarity, outlining her experience in judicial systems without embellishment, describing years spent reviewing standards, advising on ethical compliance, and ensuring that accountability measures were applied consistently across courts. Her words were measured, neither defensive nor boastful, delivered with the calm authority of someone accustomed to operating without public recognition. As she spoke, the judge nodded slowly, his pen moving again, though his attention seemed divided between her testimony and the sealed folder resting beside him. Officer Whitmore watched closely, his expression carefully neutral, yet his hands clasped together more tightly than before. The prosecutor leaned forward slightly, his interest no longer casual. Evelyn continued, explaining how ethical oversight often worked quietly, behind the scenes, precisely to avoid influencing proceedings prematurely. She spoke about restraint, about allowing processes to unfold naturally, and about stepping forward only when the integrity of the system required it. The language was careful, but its implication settled into the room with unmistakable clarity. A court officer near the door shifted his stance, his gaze flicking toward the bench and then back to Evelyn, as if connecting details he had not previously considered. Officer Whitmore cleared his throat again, but did not interrupt. The judge asked one more question, this time about the scope of Evelyn's responsibilities. Evelyn answered without hesitation, explaining that her role extended across multiple jurisdictions and included coordination with ethics committees tasked with reviewing judicial conduct and law enforcement interactions within the courtroom environment. The word reviewing seemed to linger, drawing a subtle reaction from several people present. The sealed folder remained closed, yet its presence felt increasingly deliberate, no longer incidental. Officer Whitmore adjusted his jacket and shifted in his seat, his gaze briefly dropping before returning to the witness stand. The confidence he projected earlier had not vanished, but it had narrowed, constrained by the growing context he could not control. Evelyn finished her response and waited, her posture unchanged, her composure steady. The judge set his pen down and folded his hands, looking at her thoughtfully before glancing once more at the folder. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged with recognition, with the understanding that the testimony had laid groundwork rather than reached a conclusion. The gallery seemed to sense it too, the collective awareness that this was not merely a procedural exchange, but a careful placement of facts, each one aligning toward a truth that had yet to be fully revealed. Evelyn remained standing, patient and composed, as the courtroom hovered on the edge of that realization, the quiet before clarity finally emerged. The judge allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before speaking, as if giving the weight of the testimony time to settle into the room. Evelyn Carter remained still, her gaze steady, her presence unassuming yet unmistakably grounded. Officer Daniel Whitmore watched the exchange from his seat, his expression composed but alert, as though recalculating with every second that passed. The judge finally asked Evelyn to elaborate on how ethical reviews were initiated, framing the question as informational, yet the undertone suggested a deeper interest. Evelyn responded with quiet precision, explaining that reviews were not triggered by personal conflict or public spectacle, but by documented concerns, patterns of conduct, and procedural inconsistencies that emerged over time. She spoke of reports, transcripts, and verified records, of processes designed to remove emotion from evaluation and replace it with consistency and fairness. Her words carried no accusation, only structure. The courtroom listened differently now, no longer waiting for confrontation, but absorbing explanation. Evelyn described how oversight required patience, how conclusions were never rushed, and how responsibility often meant remaining unseen until the right moment arrived. As she spoke, the judge's eyes briefly flicked to the sealed folder again, then returned to her, his expression thoughtful. Officer Whitmore shifted slightly in his chair, crossing and uncrossing his arms, his confidence intact but more carefully managed. He raised an objection, polite and measured, suggesting that such explanations were outside the immediate scope of the proceeding. The judge acknowledged the point, yet allowed Evelyn to finish, noting that context was relevant. Evelyn continued, clarifying that her role did not involve direct intervention during active cases unless specific thresholds were met. She emphasized restraint, independence, and the importance of allowing due process to unfold without interference. The phrasing was deliberate, each word chosen to clarify rather than defend. A subtle change passed through the gallery, a collective recognition that her presence had never been incidental. The clerk adjusted her chair slightly, eyes moving between Evelyn and the bench, her fingers resting idle. Officer Whitmore listened closely now, his gaze fixed, his posture controlled. When Evelyn concluded, she did not look toward him, but toward the judge, signaling respect for the court rather than engagement in personal exchange. The judge thanked her and noted the clarity of her explanation. He then asked a final question, one that seemed almost casual, about whether ethical oversight extended to courtroom conduct involving law enforcement officers. Evelyn answered affirmatively, explaining that interactions within the courtroom were a critical component of judicial integrity, as they shaped public trust in the system. The words public trust resonated softly through the room. Officer Whitmore inhaled, then exhaled, his expression unreadable. The judge nodded, setting his pen aside once more, and glanced toward the sealed folder with renewed focus. Though it remained unopened, its significance was no longer subtle. Evelyn stood calmly, neither anticipating nor resisting what might come next. The courtroom felt balanced on a threshold, the procedural rhythm intact, yet charged with an understanding that the narrative had shifted. This was no longer a simple matter of testimony and response. It was the careful alignment of context, responsibility, and timing. Evelyn's role, once perceived as peripheral, now occupied the center of the room without announcement or display. Officer Whitmore remained silent, his earlier certainty replaced by attentive calculation. The judge looked up, his gaze steady, and prepared to move the proceeding forward, as the truth that had been assembling piece by piece waited just beneath the surface, ready for its moment to be fully acknowledged. The judge drew a slow breath and finally reached for the sealed folder, his fingers resting on it for a brief moment before opening it with deliberate care. The sound of paper sliding against paper was quiet, yet it carried across the courtroom with unmistakable clarity. Evelyn Carter remained at the witness stand, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, as if this moment had always been part of the natural order of the morning. Officer Daniel Whitmore straightened in his seat, his attention sharpening as the judge reviewed the contents, his eyes moving steadily across the first page, then the next. The gallery watched in silence, sensing that the center of gravity in the room had shifted. The judge lifted his gaze and addressed Evelyn directly, confirming her full name and professional capacity. Evelyn answered clearly, stating her name and her role as the appointed director overseeing judicial ethics and courtroom conduct review across multiple jurisdictions. The words settled into the room with quiet force. A few heads turned fully now, eyes widening not in shock, but in understanding. Officer Whitmore did not speak. His expression held, but the confidence that once framed it no longer carried the same certainty. The judge continued, explaining that the court had been notified weeks earlier of Evelyn's presence and capacity, and that her testimony had been allowed to proceed without disclosure to preserve procedural integrity. Evelyn listened respectfully, her gaze steady, acknowledging the explanation with a slight nod. The judge then clarified that the oversight office she led was responsible for evaluating complaints related to courtroom behavior, including interactions between law enforcement officers and witnesses. The connection no longer needed to be stated outright. It was already understood. Officer Whitmore shifted in his chair, his hands now resting flat on his knees, his focus fixed on the bench. The room felt suspended, as though everyone present were holding the same breath. The judge spoke again, not accusing, not condemning, but precise, noting that several matters currently under review by the Ethics Office involved courtroom conduct standards. He did not name individuals. He did not need to. Evelyn remained composed, her presence steady, neither asserting power nor retreating from it. Her authority revealed itself through restraint rather than display. The judge thanked her for her professionalism and clarity, emphasizing that ethical oversight existed to protect the integrity of the court for all participants. He then addressed Officer Whitmore, acknowledging his testimony and reminding the court that accountability and authority were inseparable within the justice system. Officer Whitmore nodded once, his expression controlled, though the ease he once carried had fully dissolved. The gallery remained silent, absorbing the shift not as spectacle, but as recognition. Evelyn stood quietly, no change in her demeanor, no visible satisfaction, only the calm of someone whose role had finally been seen clearly. The judge set the folder aside and prepared to proceed, the atmosphere no longer defined by assumption, but by context fully revealed. The courtroom felt steadier now, grounded in transparency rather than tension. Evelyn's role, once mistaken for peripheral, now occupied its rightful place at the center of the process without a single raised voice or dramatic gesture. Officer Whitmore remained seated, attentive, aware that the authority he had exercised moments earlier now existed within a broader framework he could no longer ignore. The moment passed not with noise, but with clarity as the truth settled into the room and reshaped everything that followed. The judge proceeded with measured calm, outlining the next steps with the clarity of someone restoring balance rather than asserting dominance. He noted that the record would reflect the disclosure of oversight authority and that procedural safeguards would guide everything that followed. Evelyn Carter listened attentively, her posture unchanged, acknowledging the process without comment. Officer Daniel Whitmore remained seated, his focus steady on the bench, absorbing the shift in the room with visible restraint. The gallery, once restless with assumption, now sat quietly, attentive to the methodical nature of accountability. The judge explained that matters touching courtroom conduct would be addressed through established channels, emphasizing that fairness depended on transparency and patience. He reminded all present that ethical review was not punitive by default but corrective by design, intended to strengthen trust rather than fracture it. The words landed with purpose, reframing the morning as a lesson in structure rather than a contest of will. Evelyn's presence continued to anchor the room, her authority evident not through assertion but through steadiness. The judge invited brief, procedural acknowledgments, and the prosecutor nodded, noting understanding. A court officer stepped forward to coordinate documents, movements careful and unobtrusive, as though mindful of the significance carried by even small gestures now. Officer Whitmore adjusted his posture and offered a concise acknowledgment when addressed, his voice controlled, respectful, and notably quieter than earlier. The confidence that had once filled the room had not disappeared entirely, but had been recalibrated, tempered by context and clarity. The judge addressed the gallery, reminding observers that the justice system functioned best when scrutiny and service moved together. He spoke of responsibility as a shared obligation, one that extended beyond titles and uniforms. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the bench, her expression neutral, then returned her gaze forward, maintaining the professional distance she had preserved throughout. The sealed folder, now open and reviewed, rested to the side, its role fulfilled without spectacle. The clerk resumed typing, the soft cadence of keys signaling a return to orderly progression. Officer Whitmore listened, attentive, no longer directing the pace, but participating within it. The judge concluded the immediate segment, noting that proceedings would continue in accordance with protocol. There was no dramatic pause, no raised voices, only the quiet acknowledgement that the framework had held. As Evelyn stepped back from the witness stand, her movements were unhurried, her demeanor unchanged, reflecting a respect for process that matched the authority she carried. A few members of the gallery exchanged brief looks, not of shock, but of recognition, understanding that what they had witnessed was a recalibration rather than a confrontation. Officer Whitmore remained seated as the court transitioned, his gaze steady, his earlier assumptions clearly displaced by a broader view of responsibility. The room felt steadier now, aligned by clarity instead of tension. The judge prepared to proceed, the court's rhythm restored, with each participant aware that accountability did not arrive loudly, but it arrived nonetheless. In that quiet order, the system demonstrated its capacity to correct itself, not through force or display, but through patience, transparency, and the measured application of truth. The court transitioned toward its close with an orderliness that felt earned rather than imposed, the earlier tension replaced by a calm that carried deeper meaning. Evelyn Carter took her seat among the professionals at the front, no longer framed by misunderstanding, yet unchanged in demeanor. Officer Daniel Whitmore remained attentive, his posture upright, his gaze forward, absorbing the recalibrated structure of the room with quiet acceptance. The judge addressed the court with measured authority, emphasizing that justice was not a performance but a process, one that demanded consistency, humility, and respect from everyone who participated in it. He spoke about the responsibility of institutions to correct themselves, about the importance of ethical standards not as abstract ideals, but as daily practices that shape public trust. The words resonated without dramatics, grounded in the steady confidence of procedure upheld. The gallery listened in thoughtful silence, no longer drawn by spectacle, but by understanding. Evelyn reflected that moments like this rarely arrived with noise or confrontation. They arrived through patience, through the careful alignment of facts, through the quiet endurance of those who understood the system well enough to trust its timing. Her role had never been to dominate the room, only to ensure that it functioned as intended. As the judge concluded his remarks, he acknowledged the professionalism displayed and reiterated that accountability strengthened rather than weakened authority. Officer Whitmore nodded once in response, his expression composed, reflective rather than defensive. The exchange carried no hostility, only recognition that authority existed within boundaries that protected everyone involved. The clerk finalized entries, the soft cadence of documentation marking the conclusion of a chapter rather than the end of a story. As the court prepared to adjourn, Evelyn rose, not as a symbol, not as a victor, but as a participant who had fulfilled her responsibility. Her movements were unhurried, her presence steady, embodying the principle that dignity required no announcement. Officer Whitmore stood as well, adjusting his jacket, his focus directed toward the bench, acknowledging the process that had reframed the morning. The gallery began to disperse quietly, conversation subdued, expressions thoughtful. Outside the courtroom, daylight filtered through tall windows, casting long lines across the polished floor, a reminder that institutions were built to endure, not to bend to impulse. Evelyn paused briefly at the threshold, observing the space she was leaving behind, aware that what mattered most would continue beyond the room itself. Ethical oversight did not end with adjournment. It lived in standards maintained, in conduct measured, in trust repaired through consistency. The judge exited with the calm assurance of order restored. Officer Whitmore followed, carrying with him a recalibrated understanding of authority shaped by accountability rather than assumption. The courtroom returned to its familiar stillness, but the stillness felt different now, grounded in clarity rather than tension. In that quiet, the lesson settled. Power without integrity was fragile, and integrity without spectacle was strong. Justice did not require force to make itself known. It required patience, truth, and the willingness to be seen clearly when the moment arrived. And when that moment came, it did not shout. It simply stood,